this first! Nothing to see here, please!
Well, another month and another game remastered by Night Dive Studios. This time they're taking us back multiple gaming generations to the days of the Nintendo 64. A console so ancient at this point that by modern standards it may as well be the Ark of the Covenant.
It belongs in a museum!
The latest game to get the treatment is 2000's Turok 3 Shadow of Oblivion. The third main game in the original trilogy, and one that up until today has pretty much remained on the console. And if you're one of the many people who missed out on playing this thing all those years ago, which is completely understandable, well, now's your chance to see what you've been missing out on. The greatest trilogy since the Human Centipede.
You ready?
Ready as I'll ever be.
There has been a little bit of drama over this thing's release, with it getting an unintentional early release on the Nintendo Switch, which was apparently a build that isn't quite fully polished, and contained numerous bugs and other issues. So just know that if you have been playing this thing before today and encountered any dramas, that this is both not what Night Dive Studios wanted or intended. Having said that though, I've been playing it on the PC for the better part of a month, and I didn't really encounter any serious bugs at all. Either way though, it's just a bit of a shame that that whole fiasco might sour what's really otherwise a solid little remaster. Now, I'd wager that probably 90% of the people checking out this remaster never actually played the original, which is fine. Instead, they're just people familiar with Night Dive's MO, and probably have a bit of an affinity for older shooters, so they probably thought they'd give this thing a whirl. And Turok 3 is really one of those interesting titles that came out on the cusp of the next evolution for first-person shooters. If you think about it, prior to this, we had games like Doom, Duke Nukem, Quake, and Shadow Warrior. But then towards the end of the 90s was when things were evolving in some pretty big ways. And from 1998 and onwards was when we got games like Sin, Half-Life, Unreal, No One Lives Forever, and Deus Ex.
Mr. J.C. Denton, in the fresh.
And this is really reflected in Turok 3 because thematically it has way more in common with those latter games instead of the former. The whole level-based approach to FPS design was really becoming a thing of the past by this point, and the genre had become more interested in fleshed-out plots from start to finish.
Can you take me out of here?
And if the goal wasn't to do this through environmental storytelling, it was often done during cinematics.
We've always known this day would come.
Which is why it's kind of really interesting putting all those original 3 Turok games side by side, because they really all came out across both of these periods, and really are quite different in terms of how they handle their campaigns, with no two games really being the same. Turok 1, for instance, was really just a run-and-gun shooter with a bit of platforming on the side, where you navigated these precarious, fog-covered environments to find keys that unlock the next level. Turok 2, on the other hand, was getting closer to an actual campaign, with all these levels having entirely different themes and backdrops, and often really complex and confusing objectives to complete. And anyone who managed to successfully navigate levels like the Lair of the Blind Ones as a kid, without a walkthrough, have probably ascended their mortal bonds at this point and become gods. And then finally, Shadow of Oblivion sits somewhere in the middle. It still has objectives to complete along with keys and items to find, but it's now a lot more linear, requiring less fumbling around trying to figure out where you're supposed to go next. Not to mention, it's the first time in the series where we have fully voice-acted protagonists as well, outside of just grunting in pain, with all these cutscenes where everyone stands around shooting the shit and contemplating their next move.
Joseph!
Jeez, Danny, you almost gave me a heart attack.
And outside of a few key areas, I reckon you could put these original 3 games side by side, and unless you told someone, they wouldn't even know they're all from the same series.
He's right, you know.
And if this is your first time experiencing Turok 3, well, grab that tech bow and shotgun, and let me tell you what the whole thing's about. Right, so the whole story opens with Joshua Fireseed, aka Turok from Turok 2, having a nightmare about a child being held captive by flesh eaters, who are those ugly looking monsters working for Oblivion. And you might remember these guys from Turok 2, they were the ones that showed up in all those sections where you had to find all those nuke parts. After the events in the second game, Joshua's now living with his brother and sister, Joseph and Danielle, with Danielle also recently mourning the loss of her husband, Brian.
I wish you would talk to me, Josh. You've been such a help since Brian died.
And yeah, imagine having a name as awesome as Danielle Fireseed and being married to someone named Brian. Anyway, later that night, they're ambushed at their house and Joshua is sadly killed by a bunch of those flesh eaters.
Joshua!
You know, despite him mowing them down by the dozen in Seeds of Evil, with Joseph and Danielle then being forced to take on the Turok mantle to protect their lineage and continue the bloodline. And I mean, look, if Danielle needs extra help securing that bloodline, she need only ask. I will say though that it is a bit stupid how they kill off one of the most awesome characters in the whole franchise so quickly. And it's kind of hard to not view this whole opening like it's something out of a Disney movie. I mean, I know Danielle's supposed to be like 27 and Joshua's 15, but the whole premise of these two having to save the world is almost kind of cliche. Or maybe it's more like the never-ending story, with all these characters being this weird fusion of fantasy and science fiction, and unwittingly also serving as a bit of nightmare fuel. I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only one kind of creeped out by all these talking mechanical heads.
Be still! So long we have cowered like children. We are the Council of Voices.
Nevertheless, one of them is gonna have to step up to the plate, because if you've been following along since the first game, then you'll know that Oblivion, who's kinda like Turok's version of Sauron from Lord of the Rings, is pretty much now at full power. And all the events in those previous two games have led to this big bad dude's arrival. So if the Primogen in Turok 2 was Thanos, then Oblivion is basically Galactus.
Then you must stop Oblivion before it can find this child.
Adon returns again as well as sort of a guide for both characters, looking completely different to how she did in Turok 2, and they absolutely knew what they were doing here with some of those cinematic camera angles during the cutscenes. It might have been a dark day for teenagers who had an affinity for blue-skinned alien chicks, but a great day for those with a dom fetish. Anyway, despite who you play as, you'll still journey across the same 5 different chapters, finally tracking down Oblivion himself and ending things once and for all. And your first major decision is who you're going to play as, either Joseph or Danielle.
I will bear the burden of my fathers.
With the difference being the routes they often take through the levels and the weapons they get. Danielle, for instance, has a grappling hook and can jump higher, while Joseph has night vision goggles and can squeeze through tight holes. Yes, story of my life.
Cool. Night vision goggles.
Which I always found kind of funny, given his height is only supposed to be 5'6", which, yeah, I guess isn't all that tall by any means, but it's not like he's a hobbit or anything. And despite being shorter, he's still somehow a better swimmer than Danielle is, so yeah, riddle me that. As for the weapons, Danielle gets an axe, Joseph gets a knife. She's got the tech bow upgrade, he has the storm bow upgrade. Instead of the Mag 60, he gets the silenced pistol, and then instead of the Fire Swarm shotgun, he gets the shredder. Yeah, not to be confused with the Ninja Turtles villain of the same name.
Of course! Of course!
So even just in the weapons alone, it's worth experiencing both of these campaigns, even more so considering the different routes they take through certain chapters. For instance, there's an entire sequence early on here in the first chapter where Joseph has to sneak through a museum to avoid a laser security system like he's Ethan Hunt or something, whereas Danielle just goes through the nearby buildings on the ground level like she hasn't got any shits left to give. I want to say as well just how much these opening levels always reminded me of Half-Life 2, and I don't know if Valve ever took any inspiration from Turok 3, but the way these different streets are blocked off by the police with the mech suits guarding certain alleyways just gave me a whole lot of deja vu from the first time I set foot in City 17. Yeah, and what a huge departure it is in terms of the tone from the first level in Turok 2. Almost pretty much just being outright horror, with the streets and buildings full of these horrific monsters and the only shreds of humanity left coming in the form of shambling zombies lurking the streets.
Hurry, we can get up to the street!
Woo! You know you did.
In the second chapter as Joseph, you've got to move through a pitch black warehouse using your goggles to light the way, along with crawling through empty vents because I guess someone thought that would be a fun alternative to killing things. Whereas Danielle, again, just runs right around as normal. Overall, it's like they're trying to make out that Danielle is better for combat or something, even though realistically, Joseph's weapons are arguably better. I mean, his Stormbow is easily one of the best weapons in the entire game, able to kill most enemies in a single hit, and even making short work of some of the bosses. That Shredder shotgun he gets stuns most enemies who are even hit by it, more or less making them about as effective as a piss stain on a pair of board shorts, as opposed to Danielle's Fire Swarm shotgun, where instead they just run around on fire the entire time. The only legitimate downgrade I think this guy gets is with the sniper rifle, which Joseph gets in lieu of Danielle's incredibly badass Firestorm minigun. And yeah, I mean the sniper rifle does do really good damage, but there's just never really any instance when you have to use the scope to proceed, making it about as useful as nipple tassels on a nun. Still though, experiencing both of these characters gives you a reason to replay the campaign, if nothing else. And that's probably a good thing, considering this is easily the shortest game in the trilogy. I mean, the first game probably takes 5 or 6 hours to get through for a first time playthrough. The second game, maybe 8 or 9, but then Shadow of Oblivion could be anywhere from 2 to 3. So there is extra value there in playing through it a second time to see it to the end, not to mention just getting all those brand spanking new achievements. But it's never been the longest campaign in the series, and it's made even easier now with the improved performance and controls. And if your only point of reference to Turok 3 is having played it all those years ago on the N64 and never having touched it since, well, playing this remaster is like being given the gift of sight for the first time.
God damn, brother.
So like a lot of Nintendo 64 games, Turok 3 had essentially what was a quality and a performance mode, what the game called low and high quality. And if you had an expansion pack, you could swap back and forth between these in the options menu. However, both of these looked like absolute crap. And the 64 really was just one of those consoles where it seemed developers didn't give two shits about how their games ran, just as long as they looked any kind of decent. And with the Turok series, especially Turok 2 being a pretty damn good example of that. I mean, go back and replay Turok 2 on an N64 nowadays, and try and tell me with an honest face that it's still playable.
Well, it sucks.
It's one of the only consoles that I know of that had a peripheral that improved the graphics. But that improvement came at a great cost when you considered the overall performance, with the high quality settings in a lot of those games often causing them to run really poorly. And again, much like the whole quality mode argument with modern consoles, it seems kind of pointless. Simply because I think it would just be common sense that a steady frame rate is way more important than visual clarity. I mean, it's not really any use with a game looking better if it's just going to make it harder to play, which is why something running at a steady, stable frame rate is always going to be far better than it hobbling along. You've also got to consider that the year 2000 was really near the end of the 64's life cycle, so developers were clearly trying to squeeze as much as they could out of the platform despite it really being past its prime. Which is why despite Turok 3 looking as good as it did, for a Nintendo 64 game anyway, time has really not been kind to how it plays. One of the absolute worst eras I can remember in the original was playing as Danielle and having to go through those warehouses in the second chapter, full of all these mutants that look like what would happen if you flushed a deformed frog down a radioactive toilet. And on the 64, this whole section honestly seemed to run at a single digit frame rate, making it so much harder than it really needed to be. Same thing too with the boss fight at the end of that chapter. I mean, it was an outright exercise in patience and coordination. And you're probably wondering why I'm explaining all of this so much. Well, because I'm trying to emphasize just how much all of this has been improved in the remaster. From the frame rate through to just the visuals in general, making this without a doubt the smoothest this game has ever been and probably ever will be.
Groovy.
And I think few people are really going to appreciate just how much better it is to play this thing. So, I mean, obviously you can now run the game at high resolutions, but there's also improved texture work. Not to mention, they've even updated the modeling for some of the main characters.
I don't understand, Josh.
I don't expect you to. I'm not sure I understand myself.
Night Dive have also taken the same approach here they did with the Quake 2 remaster, really overhauling how the lighting works, and in some instances to a really impressive degree, where you can again see dynamic shadows moving across the walls in real time and other cool stuff like that. In some of those levels set in the Lost Lands, you can see the light being filtered through the trees and the leaves, creating these really nice shadows on the ground and across the weapon model. And again, adding in self-shadowing for the player's model, which I'm an absolute fan of and something that more games should include by default. You got a nice amount of visual options to mess around with too in the menu screens. Probably not quite as much as some of their previous remasters, but still enough so that it can run on anything from a toaster to a calculator. And for people who are really into that sort of thing, CRT emulation settings as well. I did a video recently for that MGS Master Collection, and I kinda had the shits with how lazy that port was overall. And when people asked me what I actually expected from Konami, well, this right here This is the kind of thing I expected. You know, some actual love and care put into updating something this old to bring it into the modern age. I mean, look, it isn't perfect, and there are some issues here and there that I do have. I mean, I think the modeling for certain characters can be a bit weird at times, giving them these crazy-looking bug eyes. Joshua, for instance, being a good example of that.
God damn, brother.
And some of these updated textures are almost too realistic, looking a little bit at odds with the cartoonish aesthetic of the rest of the game. You've got some of these wall textures, for instance, which are more or less photographs of what the objects are. And yes, I know that most of these are the original textures just upscaled, and they do look objectively clearer, but they also kind of look too clear in some instances. That makes sense.
All of our work destroyed!
But considering that most of the people playing this are going to be playing it for the first time, that means they probably won't even pick up on any of this or don't even give a shit to begin with. And it's not a huge dilemma, but I would have at least liked the option to play through the game with all those low resolution, blurry textures as an alternative. I don't know what to tell you. I like playing bad looking games at a high resolution. It's a sickness. Still though, I do appreciate the little showdown Easter eggs they've added in, so yeah, don't think I didn't notice that one, Steven. Final thing they've done and gone is just fine-tune the level design and the balancing, restoring cut content, and also adding in more ammo and health kits where there weren't any beforehand. And this is a good thing, because let me tell you, that original game often felt really frustrating and cheap to play. I mean, I don't think it was an accident that they completely removed the life system from Turok 2. Nor was it an accident that whenever you died, the game would restore you back to 50 health points if it was lower than that when you were killed. The remaster also modifies the level design in certain ways, and I'd really need to go back in with a fine-tooth comb and do a bunch of side-by-side comparisons like a total nerd to see how it affects things fully, but I think I'll probably just leave that part to the actual knowledgeable nerds. And then later on in the Lost Lands, there's a whole bunch of new areas added in here as well, which really all do look kind of awesome, building more upon the whole eerie, otherworldly vibe that first game had. And again, I mean, for first-time players, this kind of stuff's going to go right over your head. But for people revisiting this game who are familiar with the layouts, stuff like this is like a fun little surprise that keeps you on your toes. And it just does wonders to again show you that actual care and detail has been put into the whole remaster.
Warning, collision in 30 seconds.
What's the downside to all of this? Well, not really a downside per se, but the long and short of it is that this is still a remaster of what's probably the weakest game in that original trilogy. And there's a reason why out of those 3 games, Shadow of Oblivion's got the lowest aggregate score. Also too, not obviously considering Rage Wars, because why would I?
What does that have to do with it?
No. He's got a point.
Speaking of Rage Wars, it probably bears mentioning that the remaster doesn't include the original multiplayer mode either. And I mean, look, as far as multiplayer for N64 games go, this was far from being one of the best, but it still did have a pretty good roster of playable modes, along with a heap of different maps and even bot support. It's just that it suffered from a lot of the same performance issues as the main game, despite the arenas being much smaller and basic. I've always kind of thought the multiplayer modes come second to the campaigns in the Turok games, and I don't think Turok 3 is any different. But it is definitely a weird absence considering the amount of extra content it would have offered. It's also kind of doubly weird too considering that Night Dive remastered Quake 2 not that long ago, and they included the multiplayer mode for that along with bot support. So for the 5 or 6 people who actually played Turok 3 multiplayer back in the day, this might take the wind out of your sails. But the simple fact of the matter is that it just probably wasn't worth Night Dive's time and effort to add it back in.
Excellent.
Now this doesn't make Turok 3 a bad game, and as far as remasters go, this is pretty much still as good as it gets. But I guess my point is, if you're going into this one for the first time after having played Quake 1 or 2, Power Slave, or even just those remasters for Turok 1 and 2, well just know that this isn't quite in the same league as those other titles. It's a great remaster for an okay game, that's what it is. And if you just had to see the conclusion to the whole trilogy, well then you're going to get that. But just know that for a lot of fans, this is seen as one of the weaker games in the franchise.
I don't know.
Doesn't change the fact though that this is without a doubt the best way to play Turok 3. And Night Dive Studios have again brought a 20-something-year-old game into the modern age and done it pretty damn effortlessly. In an ideal world, every single old game from the 90s or the early 2000s will have some kind of remaster made by these guys, and I hope when I start getting my kid into video games, I can just refer him to their library to get him started. But for now, we're gonna have to settle with what we've got, and luckily that's not really a bad thing. I think the scariest thing about this remaster is that it just keeps bringing us closer and closer to the day when Night Dive are going to have to get around to remastering Turok Evolution. And when that day comes is when we're going to be in some serious shit. Because I fear no man, but that thing, it scares me.